Right. You have to say you agree, and then Sercan, if you want to make that the full screen, I'm not sure how you
Yes,
do
I
that.
will. Is it okay?
Yes, and then I need to change to speaker view. There we go. All right. Perfect.
Okay.
So let me introduce Sercan, who will be talking today on crime, criminality, and policing in Victorian England.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and thank you again for giving me this chance, for which I was very hesitant in the beginning, and I kindly thank Lisa for encouraging me to do that. And as I said last week, this is a part of my PhD thesis, which is a kind of historical background for the literary analysis of the novels I've studied. So that's why I'm talking about first the historical background. And in the future, I might talk about crime and policing in Victorian literature. So it will be a kind of background for that. And I got this idea from my PhD course on Victorian sensation novel. And so I decided to study on this topic. And I was very interested in crime in the Victorian age. So crime was an attractive but controversial issue in Victorian England. There were different social understandings on crime and criminality, which mirrored the social structure in the period. So the legal system implemented various reforms and acts to deal with crime. And I focus on how crime as a social construct was used in order to maintain the public order in the Victorian age. So in order to use this power, the government should make people believe that crime is dangerously threatening to the social welfare. So collective consciousness is pivotal in the construction of crime and criminality, and in the determination of whether a particular behavior is criminal or not. Morality and social norms also play a key role in the constructions of crime. As a result, crime can be considered a relative concept depending on the society in which it is described. One act may not be seen as a criminal behavior, whereas the same act can be punished severely in another. That is to say, these configurations of crime are connected to the age in which they are constructed. And David Taylor, one of the historians of crime, underlines the fact that there were drastic changes in the concept of crime, of both its perceptions and prosecution. In the 18th century, crime was more an abstract notion, a sinful act. However, the 19th century brought an obsession with order, power, and stability, which made crime something to be prevented and controlled, with a more professional and organized police force. After a while, this social control has replaced crime control in analysis of criminal justice system. Radical changes in the early 19th century led to social and economic upheavals, which contributed to class perceptions of criminality. The rise of the working class was a menacing factor to the welfare of the bourgeoisie, and this gap between the classes needed to be preserved by defining the proletariat as criminals and authorizing them in the legal system. As the society was transferred from the rural to the more industrial one, crime started to pose a danger to the social stability because a more urbanized, more mobile, and impersonal society had come into being. The presence of the working class, which coincides with the appearance of a criminal class, meant a lot of poor and needy people wandering in the streets. With the threat of crime, public anxiety led to the inclination to define criminality and the reasons behind it. The most common perception on the criminal personality was the image of an antisocial outsider. There was a prevailing viewpoint that criminals formed an outcast group, separate from ordinary citizens in their disrespect for the law. This caused a scapegoating of some social groups for whom these criminal behaviors could be attributed. The poor had always been pigeonholed as criminals, and they were the objects of the law. From the state and bourgeoisie's point of view, crime was generally regarded as connected to poverty, and the poor were considered as conscious individuals who chose to commit crime instead of working for a living. In addition to these traditional ideas about industrialization and the rise of the working class, there are some other assumed reasons why crime rate increased in the 19th century. The flow of agricultural workers to the cities and the migration of refugees because of the famine in Ireland caused an explosion of population and crime, especially on the streets of industrial cities. After the end of the wars in the late 18th century and the defeat of the French in 1815, a great number of soldiers were left without any decent jobs, which increased the crime rate in the early 19th century England. Along with the effect of this rising population in an urbanizing and industrializing society, the proletariat were regarded not only as criminals, but also as a revolutionary class that threatened the social and economic system. In spite of the general belief on the poor's inclination to crime, Clive Emsley, another historian of crime, states that many experts denied the relationship between lack of money, poverty, and crime. So he adds, the main causes of crime were given as moral weakness, luxury, idleness, corrupting literature, parental neglect, and lack of education. Any one or any permutation of these were discussed and debated at length, and given different emphasis depending upon the prejudices and aspirations of the individuals concerned, and also upon the changing economic and social climate within which they were being presented. It can be observed that poverty isn't the only reason for perpetrating crime. Royal Commission on Constabulary Force in 1839 reported that poverty had been wrongly thought to be the chief reason of the increase in crime rate. It was also social and moral poverty, not individual poverty, that led people to commit crimes. Thus, criminal behavior in the Victorian age cannot be restricted only to the working class. And some figures from the upper classes were also engaged in criminal activities as well. On that account, criminality might be also related to leading a luxurious lifestyle, being idle, and having an immoral character. At the same time, those researching criminality didn't focus on the big thefts, such as the ones in big companies or businesses, but they mostly concentrated on petty crimes, which were prominent in the construction of a criminal class. As a result, exposed criminals were generally from the working class. So traditional Victorian morality couldn't accept the fact that respectable citizens might commit crimes too. So regarding this social control, the relation between political power and implementation of laws is notable because Victorian bourgeoisie and aristocracy were extremely effective in the construction of laws and some criminal acts. And as David Taylor states, the law was also used to protect elite interests, and the making of laws and prosecution process were highly related to upper class aristocrats. Undoubtedly, the powerful classes used their financial and social authority. The crimes which disturbed elite interests caused impressive displays of legal force. The procedures of legal system drag poor, petty offenders through the courts, but allow large-scale corporate offenses to go unprosecuted. That is to say, the legal system was firmly lenient in pursuing the offenses of its paymasters in the upper class. And ethnicity played an important role in the definition of criminality as well. And again, David Taylor emphasizes that the gypsy as a thief or abductor, or the Jew as fence were well-established stereotypes. And also some criminal cases in which foreigners took part helped this ideological stance define criminality. From a gender perspective, crime was generally associated with male behavior, despite the presence of many female criminals. The fact that a woman committed a crime was more shocking and immoral than a male criminal because of the status of women, such as the Victorian stereotype as the angel in the house. It was much more shameful for a woman to behave indecently, as it would shatter the family and the social order. A criminal mother was worse than a criminal father because she would bring a new corrupt generation. And the weakness of women underpinned another popular explanation of female criminality, that of the young woman seduced and exploited by the men. Women were still not taught to be capable enough to commit a crime by themselves, but they were seen only as accomplices to male criminals. Female criminals were commonly thought to have mental issues, to be prostitutes, or influenced and deceived by male criminals in order to help them commit some crimes. Although crime rate didn't rise as it was presented in official records, it was used as a means of creating fear and anxiety in society. And V.A.C. Gatrell states how public fears were formed on the basis of criminals, and says that crime was becoming a vehicle for articulating mounting anxieties about issues which really had nothing to do with crime at all: social change and the stability of social hierarchy. We know that what was increasing in the first half of the 19th century was not crime, but the prosecution rates, a very different matter. The fact that criminal cases were not properly recorded in the previous periods makes it difficult to use statistics, comparing with the ones in the 19th century. Referring to criminal records before 1805, there isn't much evidence remained from 18th century petty sessions, and the surviving records indicate that few sentences were registered and filed. In contrast to the absence of archival works and proper policing in the 18th century, criminal and court records were taken more professionally, relatively, in the Victorian period. The developed police system and changes in the legal system obviously presented an increase in the recorded crime rate. There were also some difficulties in the analysis of statistics in the 19th century. Most crimes, especially violent ones, were committed interpersonally or domestically. So people knew each other, and some of these crimes were not reported. And newspapers and some broadsides were also influential on the quick spread of criminal cases due to efficient and far-reaching press. Increasing literacy helped the news to be read and learned by a great number of people, including the working class. In addition to the increasing literacy rate, the fact that newspapers were sensational pieces, both stylistically and content-wise. So this caused them to be sold a lot. Criminal cases were reported in newspapers with drawings of murder scenes and executions, and public records as first-hand accounts. Tabloid newspapers or broadsides were very popular, and people consumed those papers to satisfy their hunger for sensational events. Moreover, most newspapers illustrated also crime scenes and caricatured police forces. Apart from presenting several criminal stories, newspapers were also contributing to social anxieties about the rising crime rate. While they were trying to sell more due to the society's desire for violent crime stories, they were at the same time creating fears about it, which led to more arrests by the police and more prosecutions. This obviously served for the authority of the police and the government to control the working class more effectively. So to illustrate some of these discussions about crime, I'll talk about some criminal cases in the Victorian age. And in the scope of juvenile offenses, from the passing of Juvenile Offenders Act in 1847, children under the age of 14 could be tried and sentenced for certain periods for larceny or petty crimes. So as it's seen in this picture, a child could be sentenced to 7 days imprisonment and hard labor, in addition to being whipped, just for stealing 2 loaves of bread. And I took this picture myself, actually, in London for about 4 years ago, where I was doing my research for my PhD thesis. And so in contrast to these cases, frauds and embezzlements in big companies could be ignored and concealed due to the laxity of the law for them, because many of financial crimes were not prosecuted due to the absence of proof. And I'll go on talking about some other sensational crimes in the Victorian age. So one of the earliest sensational cases was Radcliffe Highway murders, which created a big panic in 1811. On the night of December the 7th, the Moss and their 14-year-old apprentice were found dead in their shop on the Radcliffe Highway in the East End of London. And Williamsons were murdered after 12 days in the same area. John Williams was arrested after a while because he knew John Peterson, who had a pin mole found in the kitchen. The mole had the initials JP on it, and it was thought to have belonged to him. John Williams was imprisoned after some witnesses' accounts, and after a while, he committed suicide in his cell. So he was known to have been the murderer. And also, after he committed suicide, his body was shown on the streets and in a kind of procession. So these Radcliffe Highway murders brought about the idea that an organized police force was necessary, and the foundations of a professional police force started to be established. And Francois Courvoisier was the agent of another murder case in the early 1840s. On the morning of May the 6th, 1840, Lord William Russell was found in his bed. His throat had been cut. As he lived alone with his servants, his murder was an inside job. The main suspect was the Swiss butler and valet, Courvoisier. As all the evidence against him was circumstantial, he was about to get an acquittal. However, a woman who was an innkeeper came to the last trial and said that he had left some silver screws, which belonged to Lord Russell, and had been missing since the murder. Although it wasn't clear evidence against him, he was executed. Finally, he confessed the murder on the scaffold. So Victorians were immensely fascinated by such crime stories. Although crime created fear in the public, people really enjoyed these criminal cases and stories, and they wanted to learn every detail about them. Trials and public executions were especially the most popular events because people enjoyed these kind of details. An estimated 40,000 spectators went to watch Francois Courvoisier's execution, and around the execution area, certain places at the windows of neighboring houses were sold for large amounts, and roofs were filled with curious people. So these are some, samples from the newspapers, and this is a satirical Punch caricature, which is an obvious reference to this interest in these public executions. So this paradoxical relationship between this interest and fear for crime is generally based on the rise of the middle class, leisure time, and increased rate of literacy. William Makepeace Thackeray, in an article, Going to See a Man Hanged, describes this public excitement in disgust. Another case, which was similar to Courvoisier's, happened in the late 1840s. George and Maria Manning were convicted of murdering Patrick O'Connor, a customs employee and a part-time usurer. His body was discovered by 2 policemen on 18th August 1849, under the flagstones of the kitchen in their house in Bermondsey. Mrs. Manning was a more interesting character due to her personality and ethnicity. She was a Swiss, like Courvoisier, and she stood stronger during the trial and execution. She had worked as a maid at some upper-class houses until she got married to George in 1847. She possibly had known O'Connor before, and she might have murdered him with her husband due to some financial problems. After they disappeared, the police divisions finally found her through a lot of questioning and tracing. She was arrested in Edinburgh, where she was trying to sell railway shafts stolen from the murdered man. And her husband was caught in Jersey. They blamed each other for the murder, but both of them were executed after Mr. Manning confessed that they did it together. However, Mrs. Manning was more insensitive and firmer compared to her husband. Even at the end of the trial, when the deed is announced, she still claimed that she wasn't guilty, of course. And these things caught the public's attention, and she was a very popular figure as a female murderer. Even Charles Dickens is thought to have based his character for the maidservant Hortense in Bleak House on Mrs. Manning. So here it is proper to mention another similar case. And Mary Ann Parson was subjected to torture and was killed in March 1850 by her master and mistress, Robert and Sarah Bird, a farmer and his wife in North Devon. The couple wasn't sentenced to death because the judge said they should have been released, as it wasn't clear if the man or the wife had committed crime. That created a public outrage because Mr. and Mrs. Manning had been executed just 4 months before this case, and they had similarly kept blaming each other for the murder. And another important case is the murderer Daniel Good. So his case is believed to contribute to the establishment of the detective department in 1840s. So Daniel Good worked as a coachman in Putney Park, and he was the suspect of a thief. In April 1842, a constable, William Gardner, went to his house, interviewed him, and started a thorough search of the stables where he worked. In the last stable, Gardner found a headless female human torso. It belonged to Jane Jones, whom Daniel Good was living with. Good took his chance to flee from the stable and even worse, locked the police officer and 2 shops in the stable. Over the next few days, 9 divisions of the Metropolitan Police became involved in the chase for him. He always seemed to be a day or so ahead of the pursuing police, and this was reported in great detail by a critical press. When he was caught, he was tried, found guilty of murder, and publicly hanged at Newgate on May the 23rd, 1842. So the detective branch was set up in August of that year to improve efficiency in catching suspects like Good. And these are some, again, news about him. And in 1850s, so the increase in murders by poison, one of which was William Palmer's case. And it was one of the most famous poisoning cases in the 19th century. William Palmer had been a medical practitioner for 2 or 3 years, but he left this profession for horse racing. Then he met Mr. John Parsons, whom he was convicted of poisoning. Eventually, he had a lot of debt during this time, and he had even forged his mother's signature to receive a sum of money once. He is believed to have poisoned Cook to get his money, and he possibly prevented many things to conceal the poisoning case. First, he didn't want a postmortem and wanted to bury Cook without informing his family. However, when Cook's father wanted a postmortem, Palmer deliberately smashed the jar in which the contents of the stomach were put after postmortem. He was convicted of murdering his wife and brother too, He was apparently a serial killer who murdered about 16 people and committed forgery in order to get rid of his debts. Finally, he was hanged publicly. Madeline Smith was the agent of another sensational murder case in the late 1850s. In 1857, she was charged with murder by poisoning Emile Longidier, who was her ex-lover. She was from a wealthy middle-class family in Glasgow. However, she had a relationship with Emile, who was a warehouse clerk. When her family didn't approve that relationship and another suitable husband appeared, she agreed to marry him. Eventually, Emile threatened Madeline to send their love letters to her father. This showed that she lost her virginity to him, which required a legal marriage in Scottish laws. She was seen buying arsenic, which was found in Emile's body after he died, but she said she had used it for cosmetics. Finally, she had an acquittal because it wasn't proven. Michael Diamond emphasizes the class issue in this case, and he explains as such. It was a help to Madeline that the man in an illicit relationship was assumed to have been the seducer, and that Emile, who was poorer than her, was seen as a fortune hunter. Although Madeline wasn't sentenced to death and released due to not enough proof, Eliza Fanning had been executed for a similar crime in 1815. She was a maid, and her case was alike to Madeline's in terms of poisoning and the proofs. She was accused of poisoning the owners of the house in which she was working. The surprising fact is that no one had even died in Eliza's case, unlike in Madeline's. Thus, this shows again this class bias in the Victorian society that had even for the criminal cases. Madeline has managed to escape the gallows, possibly due to her social class status. However, Eliza had been hanged after a short period of trial. And of course, the most sensational murder case of the Victorian period came towards the end of the century. And this was Jack the Ripper, or Whitechapel murders. It also redefined the configurations of criminal identity and efficacy of policing. 5 women who were prostitutes were mutilated between 1888 and 1889. The murderer was never caught, and he was a particularly impressive figure regarding the number of related crimes and the inability of the police to solve them. There was a lot of speculation on the identity of the murderer, the most common of which was that he might have been the member of the House of Lords or a man of noble birth. Michael Diamond relates the police's unwillingness to offer a reward to the possibility that they knew the murderer but didn't want to arrest him. This increases the thesis that the police deliberately stopped investigation because of the identity of the criminal. Another possibility could be that the victims were mistresses or acquaintances of mistresses of somebody from royalty or aristocracy. Although murder cases were not as frequent as other types of crimes like theft, these senseless murders have always attracted the attention of people because they couldn't make sense of sudden deaths or murders. So with the influence of such criminal cases and increasing crime rate, the foundations of the modern police force were established around the late 1820s. In the 18th century, there were part-time constables and watchmen who performed particular policing activities. Henry Fielding and his brother John Fielding had felt the necessity of some professional forces to catch criminals, and they had formed Bow Street Runners in 1749. They were actually called thief takers, but working as mobile police force attached to Bow Street Court in central London. In other words, they weren't as effective and professional as Fielding brothers had expected. They weren't preventive in the control of crime, and they had a variety of tasks such as collecting counterweights or pursuing any wrongdoings reported to them. Bow Street runners were believed to be engaged in corruption, befriending criminals, and sharing rewards with them because they were in effect private detectives, operating partly for private reward, and widely thought to be susceptible to bribery. Bow Street runners functioned until 1839, after the establishment of Metropolitan Police Force in 1829. This inefficiency and the need to control the public brought about serious discussions on the foundation of new police forces. Robert Peel, the architect of the Metropolitan Police Force, made a speech on the increasing crime statistics for many areas of London and insufficient law enforcement agencies for this rise. David Taylor proposes some problems with these arguments on the increasing crime rate. First, the rise in registered crime records demonstrates more an increase in pursuits and criminal suits than an increase in criminal action. That is to say, there wasn't a real increase in the crime rate, but in records and prosecutions with the coming of more controlling forces. There are indications that prosecutions and policing were key elements in swelling convictions in the crucial period between 1805 and 1842. Accordingly, the increasing number of policemen caused more arrests and trials, which was believed to be an increase in the crime rate. Secondly, Peel exploited the public concerns about the rising crime rate as a threat to social welfare. In addition, he is thought to have shown the increased crime rate in an exaggerated way in order to convince the committee for the establishment of a new and ordered police force. He showed a rise in population of 19% in London and Middlesex, but an increase in crime of 55%. This possibly created a public anxiety about this frightening increase in criminal activities. Robert Peel aimed to form a more effective police force, but he couldn't achieve that due to some arguments against him in the previous committees. However, in 1829, he formed another committee which was on the same side with him and enabled to establish the police force that he desired. Finally, Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Force was established in 1829. Besides the presence of inadequate and corrupt constables and watchmen in the 18th century, the new police initially seemed to have brought a distinctive force in the early 19th century. However, there were still some problems in it. In the beginning, there were a lot of unskilled men, most of whom came from the countryside and received little or no training, which made them rather inappropriate for the job. The conditions were uneasy in the first decades of the 19th century, owing to the end of the French-British Wars, increasing number of unemployed men, high food prices, and different rights in society. In addition, David Taylor emphasizes that the police were still under bureaucratic control because they were effectively agents of the ruling elite, acting on their behalf, enforcing their codes of behavior and responsible to them. So these forces had been protecting the rise of the upper class from the very beginning. With the emphasis of Peel and his supporters, the police were initially seen as the protectors of the weak and the oppressed, instead of a tool of the powerful. However, soon it became just the opposite, with the force's inclination to treat the members of social classes differently. The new police were introduced as a civil force, not an army, and their duties were more preventive than tracing the criminals. However, these duties turned out to be more varied, caring jobs, such as looking after children and insane people, taking care of the streets, and preserving public order. With the considerable effect of Peel's discussion, the new police system started to spread throughout the country, with the inclusion of many towns and boroughs. The new police system was introduced as a civil force, not an army, and their duties were more preventive than tracing the criminals. However, these duties turned out to be more varied, caring jobs, such as looking after children and insane people, taking care of the streets, and preserving public order. With the considerable effect of Peel's discussion, the new police system started to spread throughout the country, The implied idea was that these police officers would walk about the city and function as visible indicators of the power of the state, a constant threat to wrongdoers. People will be aware that the police were everywhere, controlling not only crime, but also their own lives. The main operation of the police supervision was based on the information that the police were around and about to show up at any time. In this way, the police became the agents of discipline that was necessary to exert over the poorer areas. Through the effect of this discipline in society, the police started to gain more and more power. There was a transition to police society because many towns had police forces by the 1830s. These police officers were given extended rights to maintain order and investigate anyone they please, especially the members of the working class. Although they were given a lot of duties to provide welfare in society, the preservation of public order was of major significance. This power gave them the authority to control and survey many parts of areas of the social life. Towards the mid-19th century, the police control was present in many areas of the working class and in many industrial cities. And many things were done unauthorized. Also, being drunk and disorderly was illegal, not only desirable. So the police were now parasites living off the working classes and interfering their social lives. So the legal procedures became more common in society and police activities enlarged. And by the way, the picture on the left actually belongs to a Bow Street runner, not exactly the Metropolitan Police. And the next one on the right is one of the early police officers, Metropolitan Police officers. So together with that visibility of the police control, another significant aspect to dwell on is the efforts of the police to gain a respectable position in society. They could demonstrate their worth, however, by publishing the statistics of arrest. Apparently, the easiest offenses to detect were petty offenses in the streets, such as begging, illegal street selling, and soliciting. Thus, the increase in crime coincides with the arrests in society, which formed a respectable image of the police in public. In the way the press helped the state create criminal identities, some newspapers also maintained the image of the police as the efficient protectors of the community. The construction of the police as an effective and powerful force was strengthened, especially by the publications of police service advertising, which mainly focused on the matters about the police. The journal contributed the image of the police as professionals and experts in the fight against crime. And this idea was supported by the government. In addition to the press, the new police force was apparently built owing to class conflicts, which prevailed in the 19th century. The new system fit the requirements of the bourgeoisie as well as the control requirements of a capitalist society. Whereas the working class was subject to closer gaze and control, the ruling and upper classes were using the force under the name of preventing crime. In enforcing the laws, the police were imposing a dominant ideology, which meant that working class districts were more likely to come under gaze of the police, while within those districts, certain groups, vagrants, and especially the poor, were also likely to be targets. While using the crime control as an excuse, the police controlled working class districts, so workers were both victimized and marginalized. On the changing nature of criminality to property-related crimes, Foucault emphasizes that stricter mechanisms of control were employed where individuals and their everyday behaviors are placed under surveillance. So that is to say, the changes in punishment were done in order to put public activities under close observation, and enter the control into citizens' everyday lives. And Griffith Reynolds in The Mysteries of London states that a policeman certainly had several golden reasons for not investigating anything in a rich man's house, whereas he instantly ran after a small boy who he is suspected to be a thief. The working class is commonly reported to have been very hostile to the new police, which could be related to this control of force. The unexpected oppressive management of society was opposed by many parts of the working class community. There were attacks on the police forces in Yorkshire after their intrusion to the pubs and beer houses in 1857. This working class resistance was on the rise because of the police's strict supervision of their social life. The expansion of the Metropolitan Police Forces by the 1839 Police Act enlarged the disciplinary power of the authorities. The police attempted to control leisure and moral behavior of people in public areas. Besides police surveillance, corrupt and tough policing intensified the tensions and conflicts between the public and the police. The police force had discipline problems in itself also, and some constables were dismissed due to drunkenness or some other offenses. In addition, the police were quite ineffective in suppressing riots and chasing criminals. Clive Wemsley states that in the East End of London, there were protests against metropolitan policemen who were spending too much time warning children not to play with their hoops in the streets and protecting the wealthy of the West End instead of fighting criminals. By the mid-19th century, the police force continued to enlarge. The number of policemen, borough, and county forces increased with the passing of the County and Borough Police Act in 1856. This act saw the start of the modern police service in England and Wales. 239 forces were set up, still with great variations in pay and conditions. Only half of them were found to be efficient. After that, every county had a police force, the largest of which was still the Metropolitan Police in London. However, there were a lot of changes in the people who joined these forces. As a great amount of discipline was required to become a policeman, many men would quit after a short period of work and training. Another problem in the system was unskilled workers and agricultural laborers employed in police forces. Although it wasn't a well-paid occupation, it offered good wages for them. With the growth of the police force, the 1869 Habitual Criminal Act made it possible for people to be arrested just because of their suspicious acts and provided imprisonment for certain periods. Another similar act was the 1871 Prevention of Crimes Act, which contributed to the empowerment of the police force on the public because this regulation authorized the police with considerable controlling power over those who had been found guilty of more than one crime and could therefore be regarded as habitual criminals. The detective department was established in the 1840s due to the necessity of tracing criminals through more professional forces. The police force wasn't eligible for detection, and more men were needed for this job. After some ineffective duties of finding criminals and the negative reports in some newspapers on the failure of the police to get the wanted men, Richard Mayne started to form a proto-detective department. Firstly, he recruited a few men for this job and formed a team for detection. He signed an order in 1840 allowing some active and intelligent men to trace criminals and stolen goods. He had already had 2 men under his supervision, so these men were apparently detectives. Thus, with Maine's efforts, the detective department was opened in 1842, with 2 superintendents and 6 sergeants. Scotland Yard was the address of the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, so it became another name for a special detective department after 1842. The police work was now both prevention and detection of crimes in a more professional way. In 1869, the National Criminal Record was set up, which made use of the new rapid telegraph communications between forces, and in 1877, Criminal Investigation Department was formed with 200 detectives. 600 more were added in 1883. When some divisions of the police started to function as effective detective forces, some perceptions began to change slightly positively after the mid-19th century. So as observed, the concepts of crime and punishment have always attracted public attention, so which mirrored significant features of the Victorian age and social structure. So this interest in crime was also reflected in Victorian crime fiction, including Newgate novels and sensation fiction. And finally, the coming of the detective police officers reflected Victorian obsession with social order, and which was also represented in the detective fiction in the late 19th century. Thank you. I tried to keep it as short as possible.
Oh, it was great. If you
Right.
want to unscreen share, stop screen share, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, yes.
Sercan, thank you. That was genuinely a tour de force. It was absolutely fascinating and riveting. And it's quite clear there's a great deal of research went into that and background material.
Yeah, it's a product of like 5 years research.
It's left me with, well, not exactly 5 years of questions,
Like
several.
4 years, let's say.
Let me just ask one and start the ball rolling, if I may. If I understood your introduction, which was slightly difficult to take in sort of verbal oral form, you were saying about the definition of criminality, that it was ill-defined or related to sin or other things in the 18th century, and only became clearly defined in the 19th.
Yes, actually, I meant before 19th century, not only 18th century. Actually, yes.
Okay, before, obviously before.
Yes.
Let me ask you something you didn't touch on, because I spent a whole term teaching, or some of you may have heard of David Mitchell and others, about Sir Robert Peel. And I would like to know how you, let's go back to the beginning of this period, the impact of the codification of penal and criminal code by Peel in the 1820s. And the impact of that on the understanding of criminality and the effectiveness of crime prevention, because just to cut this very short for people who don't know this, prior to Peel's reforms, there was a huge number of crimes for which the capital, for which the death penalty was, could be done. Loaves of bread or whatever else it was. It could be all kind of minor petty crimes you could be hanged for. And after 1820s, capital punishment was only for murder and not for other crimes in general. And then transportation, of course, in some cases. So I just want to ask you about the impact of the codification, clearing of the penal and criminal codes. How you see that?
I didn't actually, yes, I might have cut very short some parts because I thought it would be too long otherwise. And I'm not actually very, how to say, I'm not very informative actually about Peel. I didn't focus on what he did actually. I just
You're interested in
searched it as a kind of
metropolitan
historical fact.
policy.
So
But I'm really interested in the effect of that, the influence, sorry, yeah, in terms of the understanding of criminality.
yes, of course, there are a lot of things I mean to talk about. Of course, this is a very wide topic actually. So as you say, I mean, there are some other codifications that I might have not talked about. So yeah, but as I said, I'm not very informative about, I mean, I'm not very informed
Thank
about
you very
all these
much. Anyway. Yeah.
codifications.
Well, you did say that Peel was the one who put the constables on the beat, right? They're on the street. So
Yes.
that would imply that, you know, that's the beginning of the sort of visual role of the police in showing that the state is going to start enforcing the law. I would think
Yes.
that that would have an impact on what Michael's talking about, that if everyone is
Yes.
being watched, right? If everyone's being watched, even those who aren't actively committing crimes, it does seem to cause a change in the perception of criminality.
Yes, actually.
And the sense of risk for the point of view of the criminal, because of
Right.
the old night watchman is useless and usually drunk. The boat runners and Search Street runners and others were not particularly effective either. And I'm assuming from the one thing about the date that you gave me, one point I just noticed, you dated the Bow Street runners to 1889, and then you said the Police and Constabulary Act of 1839. So was it under that act the Bow Street runners ceased to exist?
Yes, Bow Street Runners, as I said, it started in 1749. As far as
ending 1839. You pointed in your
yes,
which is the same
so,
year as the Police Constabulary
yes,
Act.
for about 10 years, they functioned possibly together. I mean, until the end of the Bow Street Runners, because after a while they possibly decided to put them together because Bow Street Runners were also police officers. I mean, they were not as professional as the Metropolitan Police. So possibly until the end of until the end of the Bow Street Runners, possibly they function together, as far as I know.
I have a question about the sensationalism. Is it your impression, Sercan, that had an outsized impact on policy? That the fact that the press was picking this up and sensationalizing crime forced politicians to move more quickly to support the police? Is this a very large influence on how this happens?
Yeah, because I mean, newspapers were, I mean, highly influential in these cases. So yes, as I said, they both created fears, but fed the public appetite for these cases. But as you said, yes, they possibly influenced politicians because newspapers were the only medium for, I mean, creating this fear, I could say.
I have other questions too, but want to give other people a chance. So,
Sercan, nice talk. Really enjoyed the talk. Am I correct in thinking that the Lord William Russell murder was one of the cases which gave the Scotland Yard Detective Agency new powers? I was under the impression that until that murder, they weren't allowed to enter houses or do a certain amount of certain practices they couldn't do. And it was actually argued in the case of the William Russell case that they should be extended the powers. Am I correct in that?
Yes, actually, because yes, it happened in the late not in the late, but early 1840s. Again, yes, it coincides with the time the detective department was established. Even before, I mean, 2 years before the detective department was established. But as you said, yes, it might be this time that they started getting into houses. I mean, but even in the late 19th century, people, especially upper middle class people, were not that comfortable with the presence of the police. For example, in The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, I mean, the house was, I mean, the lady was very uncomfortable, and they get rid of 2 of the policemen in the novel. So he talks about it, he represents this very realistically, we can say.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
There were 2 things that struck me. Early on, you said that early in the early part of the 19th century, there was less crime. Well, there wasn't as much, the crime wasn't there, but the prosecutions were increased. So what were they increasing? What were they prosecuting if there wasn't the crime? That was my first
Yes,
kind of conundrum.
I mean, they, as far as I know, and as far as I researched, they were prosecuting like any petty crime, like, I mean, like even very small crimes. Murder was very low, actually. I mean, compared to other crimes. I mean, one of these, I mean, theorists and historians I've studied says, I mean, it wasn't like 1 in 100,000. I mean, murder actually was very low compared to other forms of crime, like thefts or assaults or attacks. But it was the one, I mean, that got the attention, as I said, because, I mean, it was more shocking. And another, Judith Flanders, I think, I mean, she's also a very an important historian, I think. She says hundreds of people died in wars, and people, I mean, think that it's like normal. But when one person was murdered, I mean, there is a public outrage. I mean, in that time, but even now, it is like that.
Yeah.
So, yes, the increasing one, the prosecution rate, actually. Of course, they don't say that crime wasn't increasing. Of course, it was increasing with the population, but not that much, actually.
Well, and the other thing that stood out to me was you said in the 1870s, you had a picture of the police force, and they all look so kind of, they're hanging out because it's so important. You said that, I don't want to paraphrase what you said, but you know, they were patrolling, let's say, or they were in the lower class neighborhoods, and there was more presence there. They were watching them. They were looking to find things. You know, they were just, it was overwhelmingly there. And what I got to thinking was, in present day, at least here, some of those types of areas, neighborhoods in large urban cities, it's the opposite in that people have this outcry who live, say, in public housing where there were tenements or where there's large concentrations of low-income people. The outcry is there's not enough police presence. So it's like it flipped. And that stood out to me like complete opposite. How do we account for all of that? I mean, you don't have the answer, you know.
Well, that actually,
yeah, of course,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead, Sercan.
I mean, we get that in Britain now with the
think
bobbies on the beat. Yeah.
Well,
We
that's
don't have
actually,
the bobbies on the beat. Really,
it is actually related to what I
Yes.
was going to ask, is that if there's a shortage, if you can't get enough funding for the police, wouldn't the middle class and upper class people be more insistent that the police be patrolling in their neighborhoods to protect their property? And that they wouldn't really care about the ones who were in the poorer neighborhoods? That's very similar to Lorraine's question, is you know, how are financing decisions made on where the police are deployed?
And crime in the 19th century was more, early 19th century, was more about crimes against property than against persons.
Right. Now, I'm talking more
Exactly.
mid 19th century.
Yeah, yeah.
the
But I'm saying
surgical-
you're talking about middle class concerned about their property and so forth.
Right,
But
right. But just being able to have a policeman within
Yeah.
shouting distance if you want one seems to be more of a middle and upper class desire. So
Yes.
it made me wonder how many police really are employed in the lower class neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, good
From the
question.
smugglers to the
okay,
Yes, from the sixth line.
What is Trevor holding up? Hold it still, Trevor.
cheeky
hold it.
blunders. What do they call that thing?
Oh, from the
Okay.
sluggers.
I've never heard about it.
Street gangs in Birmingham, and
Yep.
the 19th century, there were huge gang fights. I mean,
Yeah.
although there was poverty, actually there was a lot of employment, and actually the violence got worse when there was more employment because people had more money to spend on alcohol. And I think the middle classes were actually stressing that they wanted these people controlled because there was some quite violent. We talk about how violence is bad today, but actually in the 19th century, the use of weapons and things like this, and part of it was that the middle classes were worried about, I suppose, potential revolution or just these sort of underclasses that were festering in the in the industrial areas. Very good book. It was before the television series,
Right.
Gangs of
Netflix.
Birmingham, Philip Goodison. It was actually before the TV series. But
I honestly haven't watched Peaky Blinders. I mean,
And linking it to
so I
London,
will
of
do it as
course,
soon as possible.
if you look, I mean, you go back to, I mean, you don't need to look at Charles Booth's maps. You can look further back than that. Streets, areas, affluent areas, almost backing on areas of poverty and slum. You only had to go stray out of your area to find yourself in a slum or in a dangerous drunken area. And of course that was true in Hogarth's time as well. But so that was what you were saying, Trevor, about Birmingham. It was certainly true in London as well, and in most cities, I assume, where they grew up so rapidly because of the rapid demographical changes and concentration of people, that there was no real demarcation between affluent and poor areas, and therefore you felt endangered by being so close to these people.
So somewhere like Summer Lane area in Birmingham was actually quite a genteel area, and then very quickly it became a slum and a violent area. It's where a lot of the gangs were festering. So I suppose you had a lot of industrial workers coming in, drunken Irish navvies.
Yes.
Tracy.
Hi, Sercan, brilliant lecture. Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this for so long, especially because
Thank you so much.
I was privileged to have you share with me the subject of your PhD a while ago in emails. I was wondering, just out of interest, did you actually read up on the Bolton and Park case and Cleveland Street scandal and other related supposed homosexual crimes? Because I remember that was one of the things that you were interested in quite a while ago.
It wasn't in my, research in my PhD thesis, because my PhD was about more like class perceptions of crime.
Oh, I see.
I've actually asked you that for another research. Later I was planning.
Oh.
I stopped it. I'm not doing it, but I'm very interested in this masculinity and crimes about homosexuality, because it's really gets my attention, because for example in the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, homosexuality wasn't a crime, but it was severely punished in the UK, even after the mid 20th century. So I just wanted to do something like that, but I've stopped it for a while. That's why I asked you that. I mean, back in time, I asked you that. I remember we talked about it. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting for me. I mean, maybe for the next research, it will be my topic possibly.
Oh, wonderful.
But I know about all this Cleveland Street scandal, and I mean, Oscar Wilde, of course. I mean, is another, I mean, important one.
Do you think it might be a postdoc project for you, or maybe
Yes.
a book chapter or anything like that?
Might be, yes, might be. Actually, I've applied for a postdoc which was rejected, which has been rejected recently, because it was from the Turkish government, so that is normal. It has been rejected. So I knew it will be rejected, but I've just tried my chances.
Yeah.
I'll try with another topic.
Chanced your arm.
Yes.
Chanced your arm.
It's all right. I was rejected for 8 or 9 postdoc positions, so don't take it personally. There is rare intensity.
Of course, I'll keep on trying.
You have to murder
Yes,
people and their families to be able to be accepted to one, so don't worry about it.
Yes.
And that's even true if you don't have a doctorate. I've been turned down for 3 grant opportunities. I don't know anyone.
Exactly. Exactly.
The same thing. So Sercan, I had a question about who the police were, you know, who they recruited from, because I'm wondering whether there was any effort to get constables, you know, from the lower classes to patrol these neighborhoods, or whether it became more of a middle class, we're enforcing the authority. I mean, where did they, especially after 1842, where did they get these men?
I mean, as far as I know, they were more like in lower class people. And as I said, like unskilled workers and old, I mean, press soldiers, I mean, who had been in war and now unemployed. So I believe they were mostly lower class people. I mean, as far as I know.
Was there any problem with that? You know, with a lower class, you know, if a middle class person calls the police and it's a lower class person in charge of the case, does that tie into the forming of the detective
I was going to say the social background of the detective, particularly CID and the detective branch, presumably was a slightly higher level, because it required a level of education, particularly in terms of those who were in positions of responsibility, presumably as well.
So is that a class issue then, the creation of the detective division? Can that also be seen within your thesis?
I didn't study that. I mean, I didn't have any research about it actually. So
yeah, I'm just curious as a, you know, if they had lower
class principles. But I think, for example, once they are employed as police officers, possibly their social status they change a little, possibly. I mean, they are not that lower class anymore, possibly, when they are police officers in the Victorian age. So maybe we can, I mean,
Jack Witcher
kind of might be.
So
they were paid very well.
But the ones employed for detective, yes, possibly they were more, I mean, upper class, I mean, police officers.
Artisan level, at least.
Or educated. I know when I was doing a bit of research on the police in the early 1860s, they wanted them to be able to speak be fluent in at least one foreign language, and, you know, the sorts of opportunities that lower class people would not have had to be able to achieve the rank of detective or detective inspector.
It was Russian.
French or German.
Yes, because there were a lot of, I mean, foreign criminals possibly. That's why maybe they were required to speak another language. But I didn't know that. I mean, it's the first time I ever heard something like that. They were required to speak another language.
Yeah, it just happened to. I was for a
Interesting.
character. I was researching that as who kind of could be promoted and who sort of got left behind once you were in the detective division. I'm really happy. I'm so glad that you did this, Sercan, and I wanted to thank you because I was just researching a case of petty theft that took place in 1860 at the Crystal Palace. Lady Emily Peel, who was married to the son of Robert Peel, she was manning a table for charity of various doilies and things. And a woman, Eliza Feltham, stole some of the objects off the table, and she was caught. And I was reading her case the other night in the Old Bailey records, trying to figure out why the punishment was so very harsh, because Lady Emily herself got up and said she shouldn't even be prosecuted. She's just, a little off. And but they gave her 6 months in prison for this. And then I read more carefully, and they talked about what she was wearing, and it was pretty obvious, and that she was married to a bank clerk. And it became obvious as I read that her social class was significantly lower. And now with what you have said, I'm starting to realize that the reason she got 6 months for something so small might have been because of her class. And I hadn't thought of that, but the clothing and then what you said helps explain that. So thank you for solving my little problem.
Thank you. By the way, I've just seen the things in the chat box, so thank you for your kind words. And yes, I know actually they were not prostitutes. I mean, the women Jack the Ripper killed, but of course they are believed to be women because it is shown like that. So yes, that's why possibly I've said that.
Well, it was certainly marketed that way at the time in the press. I mean,
Yes, exactly.
The press said she was, and so
they were always thought to be prostitutes. So that's about marketing, as you said. Yes.
Yeah.
And class.
Of course. It was possibly one of the first things I researched, so I didn't change it. So.
Well, in light of Reuben Holt's book, because I think she makes pretty clear that a lot of
I heard that actually.
Yes,
you've talked about it actually in another talk. I remember.
Yes.
Yeah, I heard about it. Yes.
Yeah, highly recommended. Yeah.
Yes.
So sorry, I was called out to a phone call, but if I could add a little bit to, I think it was what Lorraine was asking. Was it Lorraine or Lisa? Someone asked about getting policemen from the lower classes. Sorry, I missed it because I had a phone call. But I know in some areas, like particularly in Scotland, particularly with the Highland clearances, a lot of the Highlanders were coming down, and they were like big guys, So they were often recruited into the police force because they were quite big chaps. And the same with the. Again, looking from Goodison's book, Birmingham had this problem that it was actually pretty rough there, and the police were underpaid. They were underpaid and undertrained, and part of the reason they raised the wages was to get people in. But again, you had like Irish immigrants, people coming into the area looking for work. So if you were quite big and could handle yourself, because they started teaching boxing and wrestling. The wrestling word, and fun fact, Pilates, the exercise, 1912. Sorry, Sercan, this is going a bit out of the 19th century, but 1912, Joseph Pilates, who was a German sort of practitioner of gymnastics and boxing and wrestling, was actually teaching boxing and self-defense to the detectives and policemen in the Metropolitan Police Force until 1914, when he got interred as a suspicious foreign German person. And so the funny thing with the boxing was that it actually it is credited. Boxing and football were actually used by some of the more socially minded people for breaking the gangs in a lot of places, because the rise of football, they channeled their energies into football and boxing. You have this idea that, you know, in the good old days, everybody just fought with their fists. That only actually came in from the end of the 19th century till about the 1920s. That was when there was a changeover from being an absolute thug, kicking people's heads in, using sticks and belts, and around the end of the 19th century into the 20s, the people were actually using boxing to channel the energies away from them. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, Trevor, you mentioned training, and unfortunately, at least here, I would say that the training is still very inadequate, because I mean, a simple thing like there's a sensational case, some police officer does something that is completely outside the realm of what they should do, to be polite. And it's big splash and the whole country is up in arms. And then 2 minutes later, you have another police person doing the exact same thing elsewhere. And you know, I sit and I watch the news and I just say, did they not watch the news last week? Did they not realize they got prosecuted for that? And so on and so forth. So the training is still not there, I don't think. I mean, because it's repetitious, it's the same bad behavior over and over. So some things, I guess, just never change.
Well, I think it helps enforce what Sercan was saying about what the goals are of the police at any particular time. I mean, I think you were pretty clear that they went from being, you know, preventing crime to being physical representations of political power. I mean, it like you said, I thought you
Russia. Yeah.
Like you said,
Yeah.
it depends on the time what the police are thought to be supposed to be doing.
And to whom they're supposed to be doing it.
Exactly.
You know, who are they protecting and who are they meting out a punitive punishment to?
And what do they symbolize?
And here, of course, it's very racially motivated.
At least in the UK, the police don't use firearms. Is that right? Is that still
Well, they accept in
terrorists?
their issue when they're in the issue.
Right.
But I was struck in Russia, I don't know whether Marina like to comment about this, but you know, people are always frightened of the police. You know, you don't speak to the police in the way that we would over here if you had an issue or a question. And when I grew up, bobbies, as we used to call them, you would ask them the way somewhere. They were usually very nice about it. And then, mind you, I mean, they were called bobbies in those days.
Yes, yeah.
And they had been peelers. And on the subject of that, I'm just going to mention
in Ireland, you'll still hear them called peelers.
This book will be particularly interesting on Peel because so Douglas Hurd, and it's a signed copy, who wrote this biography of Peel, was of course Home Secretary before he was Foreign Secretary. So he knows from the inside. I just want to mention these. I don't know if anybody's seen these books, by the way.
I've got that one.
Digest
Yes.
in 2
I got that one.
volumes. Cases of Scotland Yard. Anybody know them?
Yeah,
Yes.
got that one.
Yes.
I
Yes.
really can't do the lot. Then I was going to ask you very briefly about this chap.
Got that one
yeah.
too. Yeah.
Jack Witcher,
That's the service he says, but
real guy.
we did look him up. He was very much a real life, and again, little lower middle class background figure, and became famous.
Based on a real life case, but nobody would take him seriously because he was lower class. Yep.
Well, yeah.
Which eventually turned out to be, I think the person admitted that.
The Caroline, whatever her name was, the daughter, did end up being committed for it. Yes.
Actually, coming back to Lorraine's thing about who was recruited on the state side, particularly in New York, one of the reasons that you have so many Irish policemen was you had Chief O'Neill, He was the head of the New York police. And the story about him was that he was a great collector of music. There's even tunes named after him. And there's a book of Irish songs and tunes called Chief O'Neill's Selection of Irish Tunes. And apparently, if you were Irish and you landed in New York and you went to Chief O'Neill and you could whistle a song that he didn't know, you got a job on the police force.
Excellent.
Good qualifications as any.
But even if you're Irish American, if you came from Britain, you probably didn't get a job.
Yeah, probably.
So going off on a tangent with this Irish American police link, can somebody tell me if this really was a thing or if it's myth? The Pinkertons?
It's true.
The Pinkertons are
true.
private detective.
Private detective agents.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were supposedly really ruthless.
And
Didn't they hunt down what's his name?
something I was
Butch
watching the
Cassidy.
other.
Butch Cassidy, I think.
Yes, they did. They did.
Yeah.
And
Because I first
It was by
heard of them
Scotland Yard.
in that series Ripper Street,
Yeah.
which I really, really love. And I thought,
Mm.
oh, is this something that they've, because it's neo-Victorian and they base almost every episode on something, a kernel of truth.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering, were the Pinkertons an actual thing as
Yes.
they were portrayed really ruthlessly,
Yeah.
or were they just a thing for the episode of the show?
And were they used by? Did they have links with Scotland Yard the other way around? You know, in terms of catching criminals on
Reciprocal
transatlantically.
arrangements.
Transatlantically. Yeah.
It does-
Well,
what
they
do-
also they investigated things like labor movements. So there was
Yes.
like the Irish, I think it was the Molly Maguires, a kind of coal miners union or something like that. And they,
Valley of Fear in Sherlock Holmes terms, by the way, is
Oh,
all
yeah,
about that. The Sherlock Holmes Valley of Fear story is
yeah,
all about the Molly Maguires. It's based
Is-
on that.
Isn't there Red Circle as well? Isn't that one?
I
the
think
Red
that
Circle.
was. I think that was Italian rather than Irish. Red Circle.
I think there's a
Valley of
Pinkerton.
Fear most certainly was literally based on the Molly Maguire.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Pinkertons provided the bodyguard for the presidents, American presidents, before there was a service that did that.
Mhm, mhm.
They guarded
When
Lincoln
did service come in? Did it come after McKinley or before?
before
I
McKinley.
mean, the actual presidential service of
Yeah, they
security.
actually were providing it back during with Abraham Lincoln, so that 1860s. Yeah,
Oh, even in Lincoln's
Yeah, yeah.
time. before
so
the
quite a
assassination.
bit. Yeah, quite a bit before. So that was Pinkertons before there was a Secret Service and all
So
that.
they weren't able to protect Lincoln.
Right.
Or
They did a
McKinley,
rather, yeah, they
or-
didn't do a very good job with that one, but
Oh.
you know, there's a
Either of them. No.
theater box situation that's a little tricky.
They still exist, actually. They still
Yes, oh, they're
exist.
still very much around. Yeah, the town I was raised in, we had a fairly large Pinkertons contingent.
Well, how's that? Are they linked at all with the official police at all in any way, or are they completely private? Or
They're private, what we call private security now.
Yeah.
Sercan, your talk was so terrific and so eye-opening that
Yeah.
the proof is, look at all of these outshoots of conversation that it spawned. So thank you so much. It was fascinating.
Thank you so much.
I was just
Thank you
about
so
to
much.
apologize for the tangent we just
Great.
went off on. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank
I
you.
think it's already transatlantic, this conversation already.
So did you get your PhD in this? Have you finished your PhD?
Yes, I've finished my PhD in, basically of crime and the legal system in the Victorian novel, in the 1850s, actually.
Hmm.
I've analyzed 3 novels, looking at this analysis of criminality. So
Which novels, dare us ask, before we get... Let's get
Yeah.
on to a tangent, Tracy, if you don't mind. Which novels? I'm just joking. I'm joking.
And it was the first one is The Woman in White by Collins. I love Collins. Yes. And the other one is Bleak House by Dickens.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
so it went on like starting with the criminal identities, upper class criminals, and the detective, because Mr. Bucket is one of the first detectives in English literature in Bleak House. Then in the last part, I've analyzed some prison system actually, and in Charles Reed's novel called "It Is Never Too Late to Mend," he is not very popular. He's not as popular as Collins and Dickens, so I decided to study him as a lesser known Austrian, novelist. So yes, actually it was more like a literary analysis, not historical. As I said before, it's just provided. This talk was just a part of this historical background for this literary analysis.
Have
I
you
finished. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask, with your reading of Wilkie Collins and talking about crime cases and things that changed the way the legal system is, have you read his novel, The Law and the Lady?
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Oh, it's amazing. It's just
But I
that
know
that's
the
based on a
storyline.
case
Yes.
that changed Scottish law as well.
Yes, I know the storyline, but yes, I know how. It is fantastic as far as I know. I wish I could read all the Collins novels, but of course
I know.
I can't
There's
find them
about
here.
400 of them.
There's something I use. It's called Audible. You might find it easier just to listen to them over breakfast.
Yeah, exactly.
So are you teaching now?
Yeah, I've been teaching at a university for about 10 years. I've been teaching English and also some classes in English literature, but mostly basic English I'm teaching. I mean, I wasn't transferred to English department yet.
So there's a great interest in English literature in Turkey. And crime.
Not exactly, but students choose this department to be English teachers. I mean,
Okay.
not to study literature actually, but yes, they choose this department. It's a popular department.
I have to tell you a funny story. Oh, I go through phases of authors. And many years ago, Wilkie Collins was it. And I wanted to collect everything he ever wrote and read all of that. And the most popular ones I could find here, like The Woman in White, for example. But the lesser known ones were impossible to find. So on a trip to London, I used to buy books. My souvenirs were books. And my favorite store at the time was in London, which was Foyles. It's just a fantastic store. And I went with my list and I had everything on the list. And I had a pile that was like from here to the ceiling. And my husband was just sitting there calmly watching what I was doing. And finally he said to me, well, which ones are you going to take? And I said, oh, I have to have all of them. And he was kind of nice about it in that he didn't mind the cost, but my suitcase had already been filled with books before that trip to Foyles, that trip. And he said, we just have no more room. We could not lift the suitcase any longer. So I had to stand there and decide this one, yes, this one, no, this one, yes. So next time you go to London, go to Foyles.
Were you in Banbury at the time or were you in America?
I was still living in New York.
Oh, that was a problem.
But Blackwell's is a good choice in Oxford, but I could not lift the suitcase because there were just too many books, and it was heartbreaking to leave the Wilkie Collins books behind.
It's still open at Foyles.
Is Foyles still going?
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah,
They
we have
go
a
to
website
London
too.
these days. Yeah. It used to be normal. It was, you know, you could spend, it was a day trip, Foyles. I remember almost. You broke off for lunch halfway through, you know. It's huge. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Sercan, it must be very late where you are, so we should probably let you go.
No, it's okay. I mean,
So are you-
I'm not working. I'm not working tomorrow. So it's
Oh, good. Okay.
That's
All
good.
right.
Okay.
Excellent.
But of course, I mean,
Can I
hope
just add a
it's-
couple of fun facts coming back to the recruitment? Britain's first black police officer was around 1838.
where
He was a gentleman.
Jamaica?
No. Actually, in Cumbria of all places. And
Heavens.
he was.
Up in Cumberland or what?
Yeah, up in Cumberland, and he was. I've lost.
That's
his name. John Kent. He was the son of a seaman, between about, I think it was about 1837, 1844. He was the first black police officer, and he was dismissed for drunkenness because apparently the water wasn't very good, so people used to habitually drink beer. And it was used as an excuse for getting rid of him. But apart from that, he apparently had quite a good
That's so
record.
fascinating.
there's a
1856 gets even better. Superintendent Robert Branford, a mixed race gentleman from Sussex.
Ooh.
That is interesting, isn't it?
Ooh.
It was generally held that it was a chap from about the 1960s was the first black police officer, but then they found out that
When you say officer, what rank was he?
Kent was constable, I believe.
So he was a constable. Okay, yeah.
And
Yeah.
Robert Branford, 1856, was the superintendent. He was the
That's
mixed race guy.
impressive.
Yeah.
Wow.
That is an impressive fact.
there is a TV series called Frankenstein Chronicles. I don't know if
Yes.
heard
Yes.
it. I love it.
Yeah, I knew Tracy would like that.
When I've seen the black constable, you know, the black constable in the
Yes. Yeah.
person, I was like, were there really black police officers in that time? So now it got clear. Trevor.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually how I found
So
out.
it's based on reality.
Because my first thought was, were there black officers at that time? And that was how I found out about.
Yeah.
That was how I found out about John Kent. He was 30 years later, but I'm sitting there thinking, I
Definitely.
can accept the fact that the guy comes back from the dead, but I can't accept the fact that there's a black police officer.
Exactly.
Although he does stand in the middle of the street in plain clothes and nobody notices.
Your comments, by the way, your side point about beer and drunkenness and water, even when my father was at prep school, so this is very young, 9 or 10 years old, in 1909 or there about 1907, 1909, near Rugby at Wilton Grange, they had beer because the water wasn't fit to drink, and even at that age, they were drinking beer in a prep school. In the this is 1907. So yeah.
Because I saw a review of Tom Brown's School Days, and someone says that the children are drinking beer.
Oh, definitely.
Well, drunkenness, as I've read, was a frequent cause of dismissal of police officers. I mean, it seems to be, I think, entire, half the force sometimes was
drunk and disorderly.
Yeah, well, not even disorderly, just coming to work, going on duty drunk. It seems to come up over and over again in the reasons for dismissal as an actual thing.
As far as I know, there were also some rape cases.
That's the wrong Robert Bradford.
Police officers were.
Luckily, not as common.
Sorry,
more than disorderly, of course.
That's the wrong Robert Bradford I've just put up.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Of course, Inspector Aberline supposedly was an alcoholic as well.
Was he? Oh, of course he was.
Who?
Inspector Aberline.
Oh, yeah.
Mind you, after doing that case, it would drive anyone to drink, I'd have thought. But there you go.
Yep.
I was interested in what you said, Sercan, about the foreigners, that foreigners were automatically suspect, because the other case I was working on was the Mueller case with the railway murder in the railway car that nobody saw. So all the evidence was circumstantial, based on objects that were stolen from the murdered man that ended up in this guy Mueller, German immigrant.
I never heard about
And
this.
yeah, and he was the Mueller case, and he was not only German, but he was rather unpleasant. I mean, he was not a pleasant personality. He was not well liked in the neighborhood, and he ended up being executed. And there were a lot of questions afterward as to whether there'd actually been enough evidence, and to what extent his being a foreigner and a rude guy played into that conviction.
Well, that's the same as the Polish butcher who was supposedly put in the picture as Jack the Ripper, because one, he was foreign, and two, he was considered rude because he spoke differently to everybody else in the community. And he was the one that they called Leather Apron, isn't he? And they didn't blame him simply because he was
well,
and then there was this real fear of particular Russian anarchists and Jewish anarchists and so forth at the end of the century.
Conrad writes about that a lot, doesn't he? Yeah.
And the Mueller case changed the railway carriages, because they were private. You only access them from the platform, and after the Mueller case, they started drilling peepholes in between the carriages, so that sort of thing wouldn't happen unobserved, and it messed up a lot of love trysts that used to take place.
Yes.
Couldn't do that unseen anymore either.
Oh, those boring modern carriages.
I remember those old
You remember those old ones? Yes, I do, definitely. You hope nobody else will get on board those things. Yeah. Anyway, that's beside the point completely.
Isn't it just?
Well, Sercan, I have to congratulate you on an absolutely
wonderful,
fabulous talk.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you all enjoyed it. Thank you so
really
much.
was
Wonderful.
I really
Thank you.
enjoyed it.
Makes you want the transcript. It was amazing, but do come back,
Thank you
please.
so much. I'm going to have to dip out now, but thank you
You
so
should go and
much,
get something to
Sercan.
eat.
It was
We
wonderful.
need to close down. So let me thank you so much, Sercan,
Thank you
for
so
being
much for your
Have a happy Thanksgiving, the
happy
American.
Thanksgiving.
And say before Marina says good morning.
Okay. See
Thank you,
you.
Sercan. So
Thank you.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.